Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of the Daily Grind. My name is Michael Price, and I'm going to be your host. Hopefully, you already have your coffee in hand and you're ready to search for some clarity because we're finally at the point where we're going to get started getting to what the method actually is. Before we go into specifically the subject that we're going to cover, I wanted to mention a couple of things. Number one, that you can find the book series that correlates with this podcast at burdenofproof.co. If you click that, it'll take you to the shop page where the first two books are available right now. The first book is available for free. It'll say $0 on there. If you click it, scroll down, hit add to cart, you purchase it. It's not going to ask you for anything. It's not going to charge you anything. You can go ahead and download that for free right now. I would encourage you to give it a try. Use it as a test to see if this type of fictional narrative is a better way of learning for you personally. As I've said in previous episodes, every person learns a little bit differently, and sometimes it's a combination of ways, and we each really have to figure out what that is. If you're my age, by now you've probably learned whether you're good at reading or watching videos or listening, and which method of learning will be best for you. Also, I want to start by addressing the problem. And that's kind of what we do with the first book. The first book is called The Flaw. And so the whole goal is, I've talked to a lot of people in my life, and what I've realized is we tend to bring up the problem a lot, but we do so without a solution. We do so without working towards something better. We just bring it up and we just leave it there and we move on to the next problem. But I'm not sure what our assumption is there. Do we think somebody else is going to come along and fix it, or do we think there just is no solution? Do we think it's not worth solving? But if it's not worth solving, then why did we bring it up in the first place? So these are the type of things that the method is going to address in all of the different steps, is a potential underlying problem, or to bring forward something that exists that we can't see, that's actually already implicit. It's not really coming up with anything new. It's just sometimes we haven't defined what it is that we're talking about. So, the first one that I wanted to bring up today is going to be the laws of engagement. Now, for any of you who know anything about philosophy or logic or deeper thinking, you're going to go, well, that's not the first law. That's not the first step in learning truth. I'll agree with you, but I also agree, if we don't establish some laws of engagement on how we're going to talk about the truth, how we're going to be able to go back and forth without miscommunication or frustration, then if we can't do that, the conversations aren't going to be very productive. And so that's why I'm starting with rules of engagement, simply meaning we're going to define it as laws of engagement. Now, first thing we would need to do is define laws. So laws are constraints, boundaries that aren't passed. Now, if there is going to be a condition by which you could pass it, that condition would need to be specifically spoken about. Otherwise, in the context of how we are going to use the method, what we're going to define it as is an absolute constraint. So, unless otherwise, it will be considered to be an absolute constraint. Engagement is just going to be about how we communicate with one another. So, that will be our definition for the law or laws of engagement. Now, the other one is going to be called the law of term distinction. And once again, this is going to be our first law of engagement. I'm really looking forward to getting into some of the philosophical laws that actually define and our reality, and when I say our reality, reality in general. Um, but what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to define our terms specifically, because whether we recognize it or not, in nearly all conversations, we have the problem of assuming that other people understand what term we're talking about when we haven't clearly defined it within the scope of that conversation. And so, how do we know this specific term means this specific thing versus another term meaning another specific thing when we're hopping between terms? So, I'll bring up some examples of that. The biggest one that's been coming up for me when I've been discussing this with other people is the one I just slipped on myself, which I corrected, but that's the word reality. Okay, so it's one of those words that we've used and continually use in so many different ways that you and we just can't even communicate about it. At least maybe you and I personally could, but the people that I have been talking with, it's been really difficult. And it's not their fault and it's not my fault. It's that we were raised with a language that allowed us to use terms interchangeably that shouldn't be used interchangeably, and allowed us to use um, certain specific terms in multiple ways, and without actually making clear exactly what way that's being used. Sometimes context is supposed to determine it, but we're not taught how to apply that context properly. And we'll get into more concrete examples of this all throughout the series. We're going to see it happen regularly because it's just something that is embedded into our minds from using language so long, especially the English language. The English language is really bad about using the same. But the word that I was talking about is reality. So with reality, what you have sometimes is, if you define reality as the whole of all things that exists. All right, now we have a distinct term, a specific definition, a term being a word that defines or identifies something. Now, if we come along later and create the version where we say local reality, well, that's what's going on specifically nearby us outwardly. Or we say conceptual reality, that's what's going on in our mind. So we have three different things being discussed with one term. And if I was to say reality, you don't know which term I'm talking about. It could be any of those three. And so that's why the law of term distinction is so important, because they're not all the same. And I can show you particularly why. If I just said, it's just reality and you're going to have to deal with it, but I'm thinking about my perspective as being reality, and you are thinking about reality overall, then we may come to the same conclusion, we may not. But even if we did, we have a huge problem that we haven't actually agreed to anything. And that's why this law of term distinction is going to be so important moving forward, is that when you and I discuss different things, or anyone for that matter, we need to make sure it is that we know what we're discussing, that we're not just rambling onward, having two entirely different conversations. And that may happen sometimes in real life. Not to say this isn't real life, but what I am saying, that may happen sometimes in your conversations with your families, your friends, etc. But if your goal is to seek truth, if your goal is to find whether it exists, what actually is clear and can be known, then any kind of ambiguity, and for those of you who don't know what the word ambiguity means, it's just unclear, um, or overlapping understandings. So we can't really if we can't really know for certain what the other person is talking about, if there's confusion about our terms, then once again, these terms could be used interchangeably. There will be slips of using words such as the one we just used. Reality. I even used it a couple times within the scope of this conversation. So y'all are going to have to help keep me straight on that if you ever see it in the future where I use a term interchangeably. But this will allow us to start moving forward with our conversations. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, I would say we do that by just term implementation. So I'm going to give you an example. So say we used the one we just had. What that means is we'd have to come up with a new word for just the context of that conversation most of the time to describe what we mean when we're talking about, for example, what we were saying is conceptual reality. So if we have what exists only in the mind as conceptual reality, now let's define a different term for the context of this conversation so that there's no ambiguity when you and I try to discuss it. Because say you forget to mention the word conceptual in there, I'm thinking you're talking about local or reality as a general rule, and you can see where this can all quickly spiral out. Yes, if everybody did it perfectly and we listed the words, the context necessary, and to make it have a different meaning rather than giving it a new term, then this could be effective. But that requires that both I and you know exactly what the context of everything is supposed to be, and we have the same context. That's not necessarily going to be the case. And so, in order to avoid that, just to make certain that we're on the same page, I would ask a question like, okay, when you say reality, what specifically is your definition? All right, now let's come up with a term for that, because in the method where we're going to define, it's defined as this over here. So technically that is my definition for reality. It's all that exists, the whole of what exists. However you want to phrase that, now you know what the definition of reality is going to be within the method. It can't be any of those others. Now, if you're wrestling with that, if that's a struggle for you, if your whole life has been thinking that reality is the way you perceive it, well, then what I'll do is I'll say, okay, I affirm that to be the definition for the sake of this conversation. And as a result, that leaves up these other two ideas of what we are calling local reality, or that which is around you directly in your vicinity, or reality itself, the whole of existence. And we're going to need different words, different terms for those so that we can make sure we discuss it. Or if you're absolutely sure, then what we can do is make sure we use the word local reality, or make sure we use the word reality itself, even though there is this understanding that it cannot be so. And the reason being is because if reality is the whole of existence, then anything that is not the whole of existence can't be reality at all. I'll explain that a little more. If we say what's in our mind, what is in our mind can't be the whole of existence. The two things do not match. What is in our near vicinity cannot be the whole existence or what's in our mind. These things do not match. And that's why I would really encourage you in our conversation, as well as in a conversation with anybody, to make sure you give it a different term just for the sake of conversation, especially if you're looking to make sure that there is no ambiguity at all of any kind. And I know this seems like a lot of steps. It's going to feel like it's going to feel really slow at first because it's going to take practice to be able to do this. But it is the opposite of slow when it comes to reaching our destination, because if we think we're on the same page and we're not, that means we have to go all the way back to the step where we misunderstood each other. And I'm just trying to avoid that because that brings a whole lot of frustration in going back. And once again, this is already happening. This is already happening on a regular basis in your daily conversations. I would encourage you to start looking for it, to recognize when terms are overlapping. And I'll give you one more example to take with you. These episodes may end up being a little shorter, especially here to start when we're defining terms, because we all need time to see how these things are working in progression. If I was to go right out and teach all of our laws of engagement today, then the likelihood of you retaining hardly any of them as we start to utilize them in the future isn't very good. Not because of anybody in particular, but because we tend to remember things better after we've practiced them, after we repeated them. And so that's what I'm going to try to do, is each episode only introduce one new concept. Today I introduced two. I found that to be necessary. So some days there may be two. For the most part, it's just going to be one. So what I was encouraging you is, as you go through the course of the day, the next few days, is to look and find where ambiguous terms are. Terms that have overlapping meanings or overlapping use. And in the course of those conversations, to ask, hey, what do you mean when you say this? Okay, do you mind if we call that this for the course of this conversation, just so we don't get frustrated or confused with one another, because I really want to hear and understand what you have to say. But if I don't know what you mean, then I feel like there may be some missing clarity. And so that is how I would approach it, and that's how I would encourage you to get some practice. I think if you're going to have a conversation about anything, especially things as important as the things that we're going to discuss on this podcast, then that's going to be a vital tool in order to do so. So the other example that I came up with is like when we think of a blue house, okay? So when we think of a house, we have a specific definition of a house. And I'm not going to try to characteristically define a house, because most of us can have a pretty good general idea of what a house is. If we find that there's confusion later, then we'll go back and specifically define a house. However, if somewhere in the course of the conversation I introduce a blue house, or blue houses in general, or a greenhouse, or greenhouses in general, and then later I come back and say the word house or houses, well, now we have an ambiguity problem, because I don't know whether you're talking about houses in general, all houses that exist, a specific house maybe, the greenhouses, just one greenhouse. You see how many different things we could be discussing? And for us, we think that's clear in our own mind when we're saying it, but for the person hearing, maybe they're really good at discerning which one you're talking about. Maybe they're really good at asking a question to clarify. That's not always going to be the case. And immediately in that moment, ambiguity is introduced to the conversation. And so even if you think you're on the same page, by the time you get to the end, if a few of those things happen, you're so far from the original point, you're not even on the same book. May not even be like on the same shelf or in the same library. So, just in order to avoid that, as I said, it's probably best to get in the practice of applying this law of term distinction and just making sure there's not confusion. I'll give you an example of what I would do with that particular one, because it may make it simpler for you. People tend to remember in abbreviations. Someone else mentioned this to me the other day, and I found it to be extremely helpful. Or combination words. So if you have two different words, like blue and house, well, you can't just simply put it together and use another word and make something else ambiguous, like blouse. But what you can do is, in this case, you can make an abbreviation. You could say House of Blue, HOB. Hob is not a word that's being used for anything else. And say, for the rest of this conversation, we're going to call a blue house, any blue house, Hob. And so now we've clarified any ambiguity that occurs as we go into the next portion of the conversation. Because if I say a house, I don't mean Hob. I only mean house. And so that is the way that the rule would work in practical application. The other way you can do it is simply to put the two words together in some format where they don't also equal another word. With that example, it actually would turn out to be the same. So we could take house, blue, and putting them together, we end up with Hob as well. Or another one, house. Let's see, what other way could we put it together? I'm sure there's many other ways. I'm not going to try to overthink it right now. But, so house then becomes, as I was saying, house then becomes Hob when it references to a house being blue. And once again, this is going to seem a little, maybe even redundant at first. It's the exact opposite. It cuts away ambiguity, which would later cause either redundancy or a lack of actually understanding one another. I don't want to go too much further in this episode because I feel like we've already dived into quite a bit of material. We've shown how it applies. So if you're just joining the series for the first time, I would say go back if you get the chance and watch some of the first episodes, because they will lay out what the flaw really is in our thinking. I believe episodes 6 and 7 are probably some of the most vital ones. I'm not going to have time every day to go back and recover all of the steps or all of the material. A lot of this is going to be operating under the requirement that you have already went back and looked at past videos. And if you don't do that, it may come to points in times where you're going, why is he doing that? Or what does that term that he just mentioned mean? Most of the time, what's going to be covered will be pretty clearly shown in the title, sometimes in the descriptions. If you don't see there what you're looking for, please ask a question in the comments or email me at burdenofproofpublishing@gmail.com, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. Sometimes there's going to be more volume than other times, so it may take some time to get back to you, but I will read all of those emails in order to the best of my ability, responding that way. So I appreciate your time so much. If you're watching this morning or watching later, if you get a chance to go ahead and subscribe to the channel on YouTube. For those watching over here on Facebook or a later video, you can do so at burdenofproof.live. That'll take you to the YouTube channel. If you're already on YouTube, you can do so at Burden of Proof Publishing. You should be able to look it up that way. If you subscribe and turn on the notifications, then you'll be able to know the next time I go live. And once again, the books can be found at burdenofproof.co. That'll be the shop page, and there are 2 books available now. The first one is free. If you just click add to cart, click purchase, then you will be able to download it. There is no cost, no information needed. So I would encourage you to do that as well. And once again, thank you so much for joining us on the 8th episode of The Daily Grind. And I'm looking forward to seeing you tomorrow for the 9th.